Some moments change a man forever, and for Sheriff Clay Hartwell, that moment came when a child walked through his door, carrying another child. The 12-year-old girl could barely hold the newborn baby as she begged him to keep them both safe. She told him the baby was hers, and Clay's blood ran cold as he understood what that meant. Someone in his town had hurt this little girl in the worst possible way. The powerful families wanted him to stay quiet and make it all disappear. But Clay couldn't live with himself if he did nothing. With no doctor nearby and the whole town watching, he had to make a choice. He could protect his job and stay silent, or he could ring the town bell and force everyone to face the ugly truth. What happens when a lawman must choose between his career and his conscience? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered rope that controlled Cedar Ridge's town bell hung motionless in the August heat, coated with dust from years of disuse. Sheriff Clay Hartwell had walked past that rope every morning for 30 years, never once considering he might need to pull it. The bell had been installed by the town's founders in 1887, meant to summon every soul when danger threatened or justice demanded witness. Today, as Clay stared at the trembling child in his office doorway, that rope seemed to call to him like a voice from his conscience. Clay had seen plenty in his 3 decades wearing the badge. Bar fights that turned deadly, rustlers who thought they could outsmart an old lawman, domestic disputes that ended in tragedy. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, watching a girl who should be worrying about schoolwork and summer adventures standing before him with a newborn pressed against her chest, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. "Please, Sheriff Hartwell," Emma Caldwell whispered again, her voice barely audible above the ticking of the office clock. "Someone's going to try to take him away from me. They said they'd make sure nobody ever believed me." Clay's weathered hands trembled slightly as he reached for his reading glasses. At 58, he'd grown comfortable with the predictable rhythms of Cedar Ridge. Morning coffee at Molly's Diner, checking in with the handful of local businesses, mediating. The occasional dispute between neighbors who'd known each other since childhood. The town nested in a valley, surrounded by rolling hills, covered in oak and pine, a place where 3 generations often lived within walking distance, and secrets were supposed to be impossible to keep. But looking at Emma now, Clay realized how naive that assumption had been. The Caldwell family owned one of the largest ranches outside town, their cattle operations stretching across thousands of acres that had been in the family since territorial days. Emma's father, Robert Caldwell, served on the town council and donated generously to the church. Her mother, Martha, organized charity drives and taught Sunday school. They were the kind of family that anchored small communities, respected, established, above suspicion. Yet here stood their 12-year-old daughter, holding a baby she claimed was hers, terror written across her young face. "Emma?" Clay said gently, settling his tall frame into the chair across from her rather than behind his desk. He'd learned long ago that intimidation had no place in conversations with frightened children. "I need you to help me understand what's happening here. This baby, when was he born?" "This morning," she said, her voice catching. I didn't know it would happen so fast. I tried to be quiet, but Mama heard me crying and came running." She took one look and started screaming, and then Papa came, and they were fighting about what to do. Clay's mind raced through the implications. A 12-year-old giving birth meant someone had committed a terrible crime, but it also meant a community had failed to protect one of its most vulnerable members. In his peripheral vision, he could see Deputy Marcus Rivera organizing paperwork at his desk, pretending not to listen, but clearly aware of the gravity unfolding in the corner. Marcus had been Clay's deputy for 8 years, a good man who'd moved to Cedar Ridge from El Paso after his wife passed from cancer. He understood the delicate balance required in small-town law enforcement, the need to be firm but fair, to maintain authority while preserving relationships that would outlast any single incident. Clay caught his eye and nodded toward the door. Marcus understood and stepped outside to give them privacy. "Emma, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that no matter what you tell me, I'm going to do everything I can to keep you and this baby safe." Clay's voice carried the weight of decades spent coaxing truth from people who'd rather hide it. "Who hurt you? Who is this baby's father?" The girl's eyes darted toward the window, as if she expected to see someone watching. "I can't. If I tell you, they'll say I'm lying. They'll say I made it up for attention, or that I'm trying to hurt a good family. They already told Mama and Papa that if word gets out, we'll lose everything." Clay felt something cold settle in his stomach. "They? Who is they, Emma?" Before she could answer, the office door opened with enough force to rattle the windows. Robert Caldwell strode in, his face flushed red above his work shirt, his boots leaving mud prints on the worn wooden floor. Behind him came Thomas Bradford, president of Cedar Ridge First National Bank and owner of the town's largest ranch operation. Both men moved with the confidence of people accustomed to having their problems solved quickly and quietly. "Emma, get away from him right now," Caldwell barked, pointing at his daughter. "Sheriff, I don't know what kind of nonsense she's been filling your head with, but this is a family matter that doesn't concern the law." Clay stood slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the badge on his chest. At 6'3", he still got an imposing figure, despite his graying hair and the lines that marked 5 decades of Wyoming weather. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm afraid that's not your decision to make. Your daughter came to me asking for protection, and she's got a newborn baby that needs medical attention." Bradford stepped forward, his expensive boots clicking on the floor. Unlike Caldwell's work clothes, Bradford wore a pressed suit despite the summer heat, his silver hair perfectly styled. "Sheriff Hartwell, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is clearly a case of a young girl who's gotten herself into trouble and is now looking for someone to blame. These situations require delicate handling, not the heavy hand of the law." "The heavy hand of the law?" Clay repeated, his voice taking on an edge. "A 12-year-old girl with a newborn baby isn't a situation, Mr. Bradford. It's evidence of a serious crime." Emma shrank back against the wall, clutching the baby tighter. The infant had barely made a sound since they'd arrived, and Clay noticed with growing concern that the child seemed smaller than he should be, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Now see here," Bradford continued, his tone becoming more forceful. "I've known the Caldwell family for 20 years. They're good people who attend church every Sunday and contribute to this community. If there's been some kind of incident involving their daughter, I'm sure we can handle it privately. There's no need to drag the whole town through a scandal. That could hurt a lot of innocent people." Clay looked between the two men, seeing something in their eyes that made his blood run cold. This wasn't concern for the Caldwell family's reputation. This was fear. Fear of what Emma might say, fear of what truths might surface if he started asking the right questions. "Gentlemen," Clay said, his voice carrying 30 years of authority, "I'm going to need you both to step outside while I finish talking to Emma. This is an active investigation now, and I won't have witnesses intimidated in my presence." Caldwell's face went from red to purple. "Investigation? Sheriff, you're way out of line here. This is my daughter, and I'll handle my own family's business." "Your daughter asked me for help," Clay replied steadily, "until I'm satisfied that she and this baby are safe. They're under my protection. Now please step outside." Bradford moved closer to Clay's desk, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Sheriff, I think you need to consider very carefully what you're getting yourself into here. You've served this community faithfully for a long time. It would be a shame to see your reputation damaged by involving yourself in something that's really none of your concern." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Clay had heard similar words before, usually from people who had more money than sense and believed their influence could buy their way out of any problem. But this felt different. Bradford wasn't just trying to buy him off. He was warning him, away from something specific, something that involved more than just the Caldwell family. My reputation, Clay said slowly, was built on protecting people who can't protect themselves. I don't intend to change that now. The two men exchanged a look that confirmed Clay's growing suspicions. Whatever had happened to Emma, these men knew more about it than they were letting on, and their desperation to keep it quiet suggested the truth would be worse than he'd imagined. After several tense moments, Caldwell grabbed Bradford's arm. "Come on, Thomas. We'll handle this another way." As they left, Clay noticed Bradford pause at the door and look back at Emma with an expression that made Clay's hand move instinctively toward his sidearm. It wasn't concern or sympathy. It was calculation, as if Bradford were measuring exactly how much damage a 12-year-old girl could do to whatever secret they were protecting. When the door closed behind them, Emma finally spoke again. "They're going to hurt us now. You don't understand. They can do whatever they want in this town. Nobody will stand up to them." Clay knelt down in front of her, his voice gentle but firm. "Emma, I've been wearing this badge for 30 years, and I've never once broken a promise to protect someone who needed my help. I'm not going to start now." He looked at the baby in her arms, noting the child's pallor and labored breathing. "But right now, this little one needs a doctor. Doc Whitman is the closest—" "No," Emma said quickly. "Dr. Whitman is Thomas Bradford's brother-in-law. He won't help us. Nobody in town will help us once they know." Clay felt the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form in his mind. A 12-year-old girl giving birth, powerful families demanding silence, threats disguised as friendly advice. And now the revelation that even the town's medical care was compromised by family connections and influence. He thought of his own daughter, Sarah, who had died in a car accident 10 years ago at the age of 16. She'd been driving home from a school dance when her car went off the road on a curve she'd navigated hundreds of times before. The official report blamed speed and inexperience, but Clay had never quite believed that explanation. Sarah had been a careful driver, responsible beyond her years. Now, looking at Emma's terrified face, he wondered if there were other secrets in Cedar Ridge that he'd been too trusting to see. The town bell's rope seemed to watch him from the corner of his eye, waiting for someone with enough courage to pull it and summon the community to witness whatever truth was trying to surface. Clay had always believed that justice worked best in daylight, with the whole community watching. But he was beginning to understand that sometimes the community itself was part of the problem. As Emma rocked the baby gently, humming a lullaby that seemed far too mature for a 12-year-old to know, Clay made a silent promise, whatever it cost him, his job, his reputation, his comfortable life in the only town he'd ever called home. He would find out who had hurt this child. And when he did, he would make sure they faced justice, even if it meant pulling that rope and forcing every soul in Cedar Ridge to confront the ugly truth they'd been hiding. Emma's torn dress lay folded on Clay's desk, like evidence of a crime the town refused to acknowledge. The faded blue cotton, once probably a Sunday best dress for a growing girl, now bore stains that told a story of violence and fear. Clay had seen enough crime scenes to recognize the signs. Fabric ripped with desperate force, bloodstains that spoke of trauma no child should endure. "Emma," Clay said quietly, settling back into his chair as the baby dozed fitfully in her arms. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened. I know it's hard, but if we're going to stop whoever did this, I need to understand everything." The girl's eyes remained fixed on the baby's face, as if looking at Clay might make the words too real. "It started about 6 months ago. Mama had been taking me to the Bradford Ranch for piano lessons with Mrs. Bradford. She thought it would be good for me, learning proper manners and music like a lady should." Clay felt his chest tighten. The Bradfords had 2 sons, Michael, who'd be about 25 now, and James, a few years younger. Both had reputations as wild young men who traded on their family's wealth and influence. "Mrs. Bradford was always very kind to me," Emma continued, her voice barely above a whisper. But sometimes Michael would be there when I arrived, and he'd offer to show me around while we waited for his mother. The first few times, it was just talking. He said I was mature for my age, that I understood things other girls didn't. Clay had heard those words before, in other contexts, from other predators who specialized in isolating vulnerable children. The familiar pattern made his hands clench involuntarily. Then one day, Mrs. Bradford wasn't home when I arrived. Michael said she'd been delayed, but had asked him to give me my lesson instead. He led me upstairs to a room I'd never seen before, said it was his private music room. Emma's voice began to shake. There was no piano in that room, Sheriff. Just a bed and some chairs and heavy curtains that blocked out all the light. The baby stirred in her arms, making a soft mewing sound that seemed to anchor Emma to the present moment. She adjusted her hold on him with practiced ease that spoke of months of hidden preparation. I tried to leave, but he blocked the door. He said his family owned half the county, that if I made any trouble, they'd make sure my father lost the ranch. He said nobody would believe me anyway, because everyone knew his family were good Christian people. Clay reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a small recording device, an old cassette recorder he'd used for taking statements. Emma, would it be all right if I record what you're telling me? It will help ensure that your words are preserved. Exactly as you said them, she nodded, understanding instinctively that her testimony might be the only weapon they had against the Bradfords' influence. He told me that if I fought or screamed, he'd make sure something bad happened to my little brother Tommy. He knew exactly which school Tommy attended, what time he walked home, who his friends were. I realized then that this wasn't something that just happened. He'd been planning it. Clay's pen moved steadily across his notepad, documenting every detail. Each word felt like another stone in the foundation of a case that would require every piece of evidence he could gather. After that first time, he said I belonged to him now, that if I told anyone, he'd show them pictures he'd taken, and everyone would think I was just a girl who'd gotten herself into trouble. He said good families like his didn't get blamed for the mistakes of poor ranch girls. The cruelty of it struck Clay like a physical blow. Michael Bradford hadn't just assaulted a child, he'd systematically destroyed her ability to seek help, isolating her behind walls of shame and fear. I stopped going to piano lessons, but that didn't matter. He knew where I lived, where I went to school. Sometimes he'd find me when I was checking the cattle in the far pastures. He said it was better if I came willingly, because then at least it would be over quickly. Emma's voice had taken on a flat, distant quality that Clay recognized from other trauma victims. She was describing horrors too large for her young mind to fully process, retreating into clinical detachment as a survival mechanism. "When did you realize you were going to have a baby?" Clay asked gently. "About 3 months ago. I'd been feeling sick and my clothes were getting tight. I didn't understand what was happening at first. Nobody had ever explained such things to me. But Michael knew. He seemed almost pleased, like it proved something about what he'd done." Clay's free hand moved to the badge on his chest, feeling its familiar weight. For 30 years, this piece of metal had represented his commitment to justice and protection. Now it felt like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "Did you tell your parents?" Emma shook her head. "I was too scared. Michael had shown me newspaper clippings about other girls who'd made accusations against important families. He said they'd all ended up leaving town in disgrace, their reputations ruined forever. I thought maybe I could hide it, have the baby, somewhere far away and nobody would ever know. But you couldn't hide it from your parents forever. This morning, when the pain started, I tried to stay quiet. I'd read books about childbirth from the library, thought I could handle it myself. But it hurt so much worse than I expected, and I started crying. Mama came running, and when she saw what was happening, Emma's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her cheeks. She started screaming that I'd ruined everything, that people would think she was a bad mother who couldn't control her own daughter. The baby began to fuss, his tiny cries weak but persistent. Emma shifted him to her shoulder, patting his back with movements that seemed instinctive despite her age. "Your father came then?" Papa didn't say much at first. He just looked at me like I was something dirty that had gotten into his house. Then Michael arrived. Clay's pen stopped moving. "Michael Bradford came to your house?" Mama must have called Mrs. Bradford when the baby was born. I guess she was hoping they'd help somehow, or maybe take responsibility, but it was Michael who came, not his parents. He walked into my bedroom like he owned the place and looked at me and the baby like we were his property. The audacity of it staggered Clay. Not only had Michael Bradford assaulted a child, but he'd had the nerve to visit her family home after she'd given birth to his child. What did he say? He told Papa that if word of this got out, it would destroy both families. He said there were ways to handle situations like this quietly, that the baby could be placed with a family in another state where nobody would ask questions. He said I was too young to raise a child anyway, that giving him up would be the kindest thing for everyone. Clay understood now why Emma had fled to his office. She wasn't just seeking protection from her attacker. She was trying to save her baby from being disappeared into whatever system the Bradfords used to cover their tracks. Papa seemed to think Michael was making sense. He kept saying that keeping the baby would just be a constant reminder of shame, that the best thing would be to put it all behind us and pretend it never happened. But you disagreed. Emma looked down at her sleeping son, her young face showing a fierce protectiveness that seemed to age her beyond her years. This baby didn't do anything wrong. He didn't ask to be born from something terrible. If I let them take him away, it's like saying that what Michael did was so bad that even an innocent child should be punished for it. The wisdom in her words struck Clay with profound force. This 12-year-old girl understood something about justice and innocence that many adults never grasped. "So you took him and came here." I waited until they were all arguing in the kitchen about what to do. Then I wrapped the baby in my quilt and climbed out my bedroom window. "I knew you were a good man, Sheriff. You were always kind to Sarah when she was alive, and people said you never broke a promise." The mention of his daughter's name sent a stab of pain through Clay's chest. Sarah would have been about Emma's age when she died, full of dreams and possibilities that had been cut short. Now, looking at Emma's determined face, he felt as if fate had given him a chance to protect the daughter he'd lost. The office door opened, and Deputy Rivera stepped inside. "Sheriff, we've got a problem. There's a crowd gathering outside, maybe 20 people. The Bradfords and Caldwells are out there, along with Mayor Johnston and half the town council. They're demanding you release the girl to her parents immediately." Clay looked toward the window, seeing the faces pressed against the glass. People he'd known for decades, people he'd considered friends and allies, now stood outside his office like an angry mob demanding he surrender a frightened child to the very people who'd failed to protect her. "Deputy, I want you to lock that door and don't open it for anyone except Doc Whitman or a state trooper. This little girl and her baby are under my protection now, and I'll be damned if I let them be intimidated by a crowd." As Clay spoke these words, he realized he'd crossed a line from which there would be no return. By choosing to protect Emma and her baby, he was declaring war on the power structure that had controlled Cedar Ridge for generations. It was a war he wasn't sure he could win, but it was a fight he knew he had to wage. The torn dress on his desk seemed to watch him, a silent witness to the courage it would take to see justice done. Clay's father's compass rested in the bottom drawer of his desk, its brass surface worn smooth by generations of hands seeking direction. Samuel Hartwell had carried it through 2 wars and 30 years of ranching before passing it to his son with simple advice: "When you can't see the path ahead, this will help you find true north." Now, as angry voices rose outside his office windows, Clay found himself reaching for that familiar weight, needing its steady presence to anchor him in the moral storm ahead. The compass needle pointed steadily northward, indifferent to the chaos swirling around it. Clay wished his own sense of direction felt as certain, Protecting Emma and her baby was the right thing to do. He had no doubt about that. But the consequences of that choice were beginning to unfold in ways that threatened everything he'd built in 3 decades of service. "Sheriff," Deputy Rivera said quietly, peering through the blinds, "Mayor Johnston is demanding to speak with you. Says he's got the authority to override your decision if you're acting contrary to the town's interests." Clay looked at Emma, who sat in the corner cradling her baby. The infant had grown increasingly restless, his tiny fists clenched and his breathing shallow. Without proper medical attention, Clay worried the child might not survive his first day of life. "Tell the mayor that if he wants to discuss police business, he can make an appointment during regular hours. Right now, I'm dealing with a criminal investigation that takes precedence over politics." The words felt strange in Clay's mouth. For 30 years, he'd worked within the system, building relationships and maintaining the delicate balance that kept a small town functioning. He'd always believed that cooperation and compromise were more effective than confrontation. But looking at Emma's frightened face, he realized that some situations demanded a different approach. "Emma," he said gently, "I need to ask you about other children in town. You mentioned that Michael showed you newspaper clippings about other girls who'd made accusations. Did you ever see or hear anything that made you think he'd hurt someone else?" The girl shifted the baby to her other arm, her young face creasing with concentration. "There was Jenny Morrison. She used to be in my Sunday school class, but she stopped coming to church about 2 years ago. People said her family moved away because her father got a job somewhere else. But Jenny told me once that she was scared of someone in town." Clay made a note. He remembered the Morrison family, hard-working people who'd run a small feed store on the edge of town. Their departure had seemed sudden, and he'd always wondered why they'd left without saying goodbye to friends they'd known for years. "Anyone else?" Lucy Preston stopped coming to school last spring. Her parents said she was being homeschooled, but I saw her once at the general store with her mother. She looked different, scared, like she was always watching over her shoulder. The Preston family owned a small farm north of town. Clay had responded to a domestic disturbance call there about 6 months ago, but when he'd arrived, Tom Preston had insisted everything was fine. Preston had seemed nervous, eager to get Clay to leave without asking too many questions. "Emma, I want you to think carefully about this next question. Did Michael ever mention specific places where he took girls, locations where he felt safe, from being discovered?" Emma's eyes closed as she searched her memory. "He had a cabin somewhere up in the hills. He called it his special place, where he could be himself without his parents watching. He said he'd been using it since he was 16, that his father had given it to him as a place to sow his wild oats." Clay felt sick. Thomas Bradford had essentially provided his son with a private location for assault, either through willful ignorance or active complicity. Either way, the Bradford family's guilt extended far beyond Michael's individual crimes. The baby began to cry, a weak, mewing sound that spoke of distress beyond simple hunger or discomfort. Emma looked up at Clay with panic in her eyes. "Something's wrong with him. He's been getting weaker since this morning, and he won't eat properly." Clay had helped deliver calves and foals over the years, and he recognized the signs of a newborn in distress. Without immediate medical intervention, Emma's baby might not survive the day. "I'm going to try Doc Whitman again," Clay said, reaching for the phone. "I don't care about his family connections. He took an oath to help people, and this baby needs help now." The phone rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered. "Whitman residence." "Mrs. Whitman, this is Sheriff Hartwell. I need Doc to come to my office immediately. I have a newborn who requires medical attention." There was a long pause. "I'm sorry, Sheriff, but Dr. Whitman is dealing with an emergency in Riverside. He won't be back until late tonight." Riverside was 3 towns over, a 4-hour round trip even in good weather. Clay suspected this emergency had been conveniently arranged to keep the doctor away from Cedar Ridge until the Bradford family could resolve their problem. Mrs. Whitman, this is a matter of life and death. A baby could die without immediate care. Another pause. Perhaps you should contact the family's own physician. I'm sure they have resources available. The line went dead. Clay stared at the receiver, understanding that he was now completely on his own. The town's medical establishment, like its political and economic leadership, had closed ranks against him. He walked to the window and peered through the blinds at the crowd outside. The number of people had grown to nearly 30, and he could see Thomas Bradford speaking animatedly with Mayor Johnston. Other faces in the crowd included members of the town council, prominent business owners, and several families whose children attended school with Emma. What struck him most was not the anger on their faces, but the fear. These people weren't just upset about a disruption to their comfortable lives. They were terrified of what Emma might reveal if given the chance to speak freely. "Sheriff?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "Are you going to let them take us?" Clay turned back to her, seeing his own daughter's face superimposed over hers. Sarah had trusted him to protect her, and he'd failed. She'd died alone on a dark road, and he'd never even known she was in danger. Now he had a second chance to stand between a child and the forces that threatened to destroy her. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not going to let them take you anywhere you don't want to go." He returned to his desk and pulled out a road atlas, studying the routes that led to the state capitol. It would be a 3-hour drive to reach the nearest state police barracks, but once they were outside Cedar Ridge, Emma and her baby would be beyond the reach of local influence. "Emma, how would you feel about taking a ride with me? Somewhere. We can get proper medical attention for your baby and make sure your story is heard by people who can't be pressured to look the other way." Hope flickered in the girl's eyes for the first time since she'd arrived. "You'd really do that, even if it means all those people outside will hate you?" Clay picked up his father's compass, feeling its steady weight in his palm. The needle pointed. True north, unwavering despite the chaos around it. He clipped it to his belt, next to his badge, and felt some of his uncertainty begin to fade. "Emma, I learned a long time ago that doing the right thing isn't always the same as doing the popular thing. Sometimes a man has to choose between being liked and being able to look at himself in the mirror." Outside, the crowd's voices grew louder and more insistent. Clay could hear Thomas Bradford demanding that he be allowed to speak with his family's employee, a phrase that made Clay's blood boil. Emma wasn't an employee. She was a victim who deserved justice, not continued exploitation. As Clay began to formulate a plan for getting Emma and her baby safely out of town, he thought about the other children whose lives might depend on his actions. Jenny Morrison, wherever she was now. Lucy Preston, hiding in her family's farmhouse. Other girls whose names he might never know, but whose suffering could end if he had the courage to see this through. The compass needle held steady, pointing toward the truth that could set them all free. Sarah's music box sat on the shelf behind Clay's desk, its delicate ballerina frozen mid-pirouette for the 10 years since his daughter's death. The tiny dancer wore a pink tutu and held her arms in perfect position, waiting for someone to wind the key that would bring her back to life. Clay hadn't been able to bring himself to pack it away after Sarah died, and now its presence seemed to watch over Emma with protective grace. Emma had fallen asleep in the chair, exhaustion finally overcoming fear. The baby lay against her chest, his breathing more labored than before. Clay studied the infant's pale complexion and realized they were running out of time. Whatever medical emergency Doc Whitman was supposedly handling, this baby's life hung in the balance. "Sheriff," Deputy Rivera whispered from his position by the window, "I think you should see this." Clay joined him at the blinds and peered outside. The crowd had organized itself into what looked like a vigil, with Thomas Bradford clearly directing the arrangement. People held signs reading, "Protect our families" and "Stop false accusations," messages that revealed how quickly the Bradford influence machine had swung into action. But what chilled Clay's blood was seeing several children in the crowd, including Lucy Preston. The 13-year-old girl stood beside her parents, her eyes fixed on the sheriff's office windows with an expression of desperate hope mixed with terror. She was thin, too thin, and kept one hand pressed protectively over her stomach in a gesture Clay was beginning to recognize. "Marcus," Clay said quietly, "I want you to take a good look at Lucy Preston out there. Tell me what you see." Rivera studied the girl for several moments. "She looks scared, Sheriff. And, oh hell, you think she's pregnant too? I think we're looking at a pattern here. How many young girls have left town or stopped appearing in public over the past couple of years?" Rivera's face grew grim as he considered the implications. "Jenny Morrison, like Emma mentioned. The Hartley girl moved away last summer. Her family said it was for her father's work, but that seemed sudden. And now Lucy Preston looks like she's trying to hide something under that loose dress." Clay felt the weight of his father's compass at his belt, its steady presence reminding him that sometimes the right path was the hardest one to walk. "Marcus, I need you to make a choice. You can walk away from this right now. Tell people you were just following orders, that you didn't know what was really happening. Or you can help me protect these children and expose the truth, even if it costs us both our jobs." The younger man was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Emma and the crowd outside. Finally, he straightened his shoulders and adjusted his own badge. "Sheriff, my wife died because she couldn't afford the medical care she needed when her cancer came back. The Bradford family owns the biggest ranch, the bank, and half the businesses in this county, but they couldn't find the decency to help a good woman get treatment. If they're hurting children on top of that, then I'd rather lose my job than let it continue." Clay felt a surge of gratitude for his deputy's courage. "All right then, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to take Emma and the baby to the state capitol, get them proper medical care, and file a formal complaint with the state attorney general's office. You're going to stay here and keep an eye on things, but more importantly, you're going to start documenting everything you can about families who've left town suddenly or children who've disappeared from public view." Rivera nodded. "What about the crowd outside? Let me worry about them. But Marcus, if something happens to me on the way to the Capitol, I want you to know that there's more to this than just Michael Bradford. I think we're looking at a systematic pattern of abuse that goes back years, possibly involving multiple members of powerful families in this town." Emma stirred in her sleep, and the baby's crying grew weaker. Clay made his decision. He couldn't wait any longer for perfect conditions or ideal circumstances. Every minute they delayed increased the risk to the infant's life. "Emma," he said gently, shaking her shoulder, "we need to go now." The girl's eyes opened, immediately alert despite her exhaustion. "Are we leaving town?" "Yes. We're going to get your baby the medical care he needs, and we're going to make sure your story is heard by people who can't be bought or intimidated." Clay moved to his desk and began gathering essential items: his service weapon, handcuffs, the recording device with Emma's testimony, and several files related to families who'd left town abruptly. He also took Sarah's music box, wrapping it carefully in a towel. Something about the frozen ballerina reminded him of Emma, young, vulnerable, but possessing a strength that could endure even when the music stopped. "Sheriff," Emma said, struggling to her feet with the baby in her arms, "what if they try to stop us from leaving?" Clay looked out at the crowd again, noting how strategically they'd positioned themselves. Thomas Bradford stood directly in front of the office door, while other groups blocked the side exits and the path to the parking area where Clay's patrol car waited. "We'll deal with that when we come to it. Right now, my main concern is getting this baby to a hospital." As if summoned by his words, Mayor Johnston's voice boomed from outside. "Sheriff Hartwell, this has gone on long enough. You have no authority to hold that girl against her parents' wishes, and you're creating a public disturbance with your stubborn refusal to cooperate." Clay opened the door and stepped outside, keeping Emma and the baby behind him. The August heat hit him like a wall, but the coldness in the eyes of people he'd known for decades chilled him more than any winter storm. "Mayor Johnston," Clay said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "I'm conducting a criminal investigation. This young lady and her child are under my protection until I can ensure their safety." Thomas Bradford stepped forward, his expensive suit somehow remaining unwrinkled despite the heat. "Sheriff, you're clearly out of your depth here. This is a family matter that requires discretion and understanding, not heavy-handed law enforcement tactics. The Caldwell family has asked for privacy to deal with their daughter's situation." "Situation?" Clay's voice rose slightly. "Mr. Bradford, we're talking about the assault of a 12-year-old child and the birth of her baby. That's not a situation. That's a serious crime that demands investigation and justice." Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, and Clay noticed that not everyone present seemed entirely comfortable with Bradford's version of events. A few faces showed doubt, concern, even quiet support for Clay's position. Bradford's composure slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath his polished exterior. "Sheriff, I think you need to be very careful about making wild accusations without proof. Slander is a serious matter, and my family has resources to defend our reputation against false claims." The threat was delivered with a smile, but its meaning was clear. Clay felt Emma move closer behind him, the baby's weak cries barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. "I'm not making accusations, Mr. Bradford. I'm stating facts based on testimony from a victim who came to me seeking help. If you have a problem with that, you're welcome to file a complaint with the state authorities." That's when Clay saw it. A brief exchange of looks between Bradford and several other men in the crowd, including Robert Caldwell and Dr. Whitman's brother-in-law. It was the kind of wordless communication that spoke of shared secrets and coordinated responses. These men weren't just trying to cover up one incident. They were protecting something much larger. "Emma," Clay said quietly without turning around, "I want you to go back inside and wait for my signal. When I tell you to run, you take that baby and head straight for my patrol car. Don't stop for anything." He could feel her nod behind him, understanding instinctively that the situation was about to escalate. "Sheriff Hartwell," Mayor Johnston said, his tone becoming more official, "by the authority vested in me as mayor of Cedar Ridge, I'm ordering you to release Emma Caldwell to her parents immediately. If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to declare you unfit for duty and suspend you pending a full investigation." Clay's hand moved to his father's compass, drawing strength from its steady presence. "Mayor, you don't have the authority to suspend an elected sheriff without due process, and even if you did, my oath is to protect and serve the people of this county, not to bow to political pressure." The crowd was growing restless, and Clay could sense the tension building toward something that might spiral out of control. But as he looked at the faces around him, he also saw something that gave him hope. Several people were hanging back from the main group, their expressions suggesting they weren't entirely convinced by Bradford's narrative. Among them was Martha Caldwell, Emma's mother. The woman looked haggard and frightened, but when her eyes met Clay's, he saw something that surprised him, gratitude mixed with desperate hope. She might have been pressured into going along with the cover-up initially, but seeing her daughter's courage was awakening her own protective instincts. "Mrs. Caldwell," Clay called out, his voice carrying across the crowd, "your daughter showed incredible bravery coming to me for help. She's trying to protect her baby and do the right thing, even when it's difficult. Don't you think she deserves our support instead of our condemnation?" Martha Caldwell's face crumpled, and Clay saw tears begin to stream down her cheeks. She took a hesitant step forward, separating herself slightly from the main group. "Emma," she called out, her voice breaking, "Mama's here, baby, Mama's here." It was the first crack in the wall of community pressure, and Clay sensed it might be the opening he needed. But before he could capitalize on the moment, Thomas Bradford moved swiftly to Martha's side, placing a firm hand on her arm. "Martha, you're upset and not thinking clearly," he said, in a voice meant to sound concerned but carrying an undertone of warning. "Let us handle this properly. Your family has been through enough trauma already. The sight of Bradford controlling Emma's mother with physical intimidation was the last straw for Clay. He'd watched this man manipulate and threaten people for too long, hiding behind a facade of respectability while orchestrating crimes against children. "Take your hands off her," Clay said, his voice low but carrying enough authority to cut through the crowd's murmur. "Mrs. Caldwell is free to make her own choices about her daughter's welfare." Bradford's mask of civility finally slipped completely. "Sheriff, you're way out of line. This family doesn't need your interference, and this town doesn't need your brand of self-righteous grandstanding." "What this town needs," Clay replied, stepping forward, "is someone willing to protect children from predators, even when those predators hide behind money and influence." The word predators hit the crowd like a lightning bolt. Several people gasped, others began talking among themselves, and Clay saw fear flash across Bradford's face before he could control his expression. "That's slander," Bradford said quickly, but his voice had lost its confident tone. "You have no proof of any wrongdoing by anyone in my family. I have the testimony of a 12-year-old victim and a newborn baby who's fighting for his life because he was denied proper medical care," Clay replied. "If that's not enough to start an investigation, then this town has bigger problems than I thought." As if summoned by his words, the baby's cries grew weaker, and Clay realized they were rapidly running out of time. Whatever game the Bradford family was playing, an innocent child's life hung in the balance. "Emma," he called out, "it's time to go." The crowd stirred as Emma appeared in the doorway, clutching her baby. The sight of the 12-year-old mother seemed to drive home the reality of the situation to several onlookers, and Clay saw doubt beginning to replace certainty in many faces. It was time to make his move toward the patrol car. But Clay knew the next few minutes would determine whether justice would prevail or whether the Bradford family's influence would claim another victory over truth. The Bradford family portrait hung in the lobby of Cedar Ridge First National Bank like a monument to respectability and power. Thomas Bradford stood in the center, wearing his finest suit, his wife Eleanor beside him in pearls and silk, their two sons flanking them with confident smiles that spoke of privilege and entitlement. The painting had been commissioned 5 years earlier, when Michael was still being groomed to take over the family empire, and James was finishing his education back east. To anyone walking into the bank, it proclaimed the Bradfords as pillars of the community, successful and honorable citizens whose judgment could be trusted. Clay had seen that portrait countless times over the years, but now it seemed to mock him with its false representation of virtue. Behind those painted smiles lay secrets that had destroyed lives and silenced victims, all protected by the very respectability the portrait was meant to project. The confrontation outside his office had ended with Emma and her baby safely loaded into his patrol car, but not without cost. As they'd driven away from the crowd, Clay had seen the mixture of anger and fear in people's faces, and he knew there would be consequences for defying the Bradford family so publicly. By the time they returned, if they returned, Cedar Ridge would be a very different place for both of them. Now, sitting in the hospital waiting room 3 hours away in the state capital, Clay watched Emma pace nervously while doctors examined her baby. The infant had been rushed into emergency care as soon as they'd arrived, his breathing shallow and his color poor. The pediatric team had worked with quiet efficiency, asking few questions about the circumstances that had brought a 12-year-old mother and a small-town sheriff to their doors in the middle of the night. "Sheriff Hartwell?" A doctor in green scrubs emerged from the examination room, her expression serious but not despairing. "I'm Dr. Patricia Santos. I've been taking care of the baby." Clay stood, Emma immediately joining him. "How is he, doctor?" "He's stable, but he was born with some complications that required immediate intervention. Premature infants often have breathing difficulties, and this little one also shows signs of dehydration and low blood sugar. We've got him on oxygen and IV fluids, and his vital signs are improving. Emma's knees nearly buckled with relief. Is he going to be all right? Dr. Santos studied Emma's young face with the kind of careful assessment that suggested she'd seen similar situations before. With proper care, I expect him to recover fully, but I need to ask you some questions about the birth and the circumstances surrounding it. Clay stepped forward. Doctor, this situation involves allegations of child abuse and assault. I'd like to request that any examination findings be documented as potential evidence, and that you report this case to the appropriate state authorities. Dr. Santos nodded. I've already contacted Child Protective Services and the state police. They'll want to interview both of you, and they'll need a full medical examination of the mother as well as the baby. Over the next several hours, Clay found himself in a world far removed from small-town politics and family influence. State investigators listened to Emma's recorded testimony with professional detachment, taking detailed notes and asking follow-up questions that revealed their experience with similar cases. A social worker sat with Emma during her medical examination, offering support and explaining her rights as both a victim and a mother. Sheriff, Detective Maria Rodriguez said, as they concluded Emma's initial interview, this case has elements that suggest we're looking at more than an isolated incident. The victim's testimony about other girls, the coordinated response to silence her, the involvement of prominent community figures, these are patterns we see in systematic abuse cases. Clay felt both vindicated and horrified. Detective, I've been thinking the same thing. There are several families that have left our town abruptly over the past few years, and other children who've withdrawn from public activities. I think Emma may be just the first victim brave enough to speak publicly. We'll need to investigate those other cases, but that will require cooperation from your local authorities. How do you assess the likelihood of getting that cooperation? Clay thought about the crowd outside his office, about Mayor Johnston's threats and Thomas Bradford's barely concealed menace. Detective, I think you'll find that certain elements in Cedar Ridge have a vested interest in keeping this investigation from moving forward. But there are good people in that town too, people who'll do the right thing once they understand what's really been happening. Detective Rodriguez made another note. We'll be sending a team to Cedar Ridge tomorrow to begin interviews and collect evidence. I want you to know that your actions in protecting this girl probably saved her baby's life. Another few hours without medical care, and we might be having a very different conversation. As dawn broke over the state capitol, Clay found himself standing at a hospital window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Emma was finally sleeping, her baby beside her in a bassinet, surrounded by monitoring equipment, but breathing steadily on his own. The immediate crisis had passed, but Clay knew the real battle was just beginning. His cell phone buzzed with a text message from Deputy Rivera. Crowd dispersed around midnight. Bradford family called emergency. Town council meeting for this morning. Mayor talking about having you arrested for kidnapping when you return. Stay safe. Clay deleted the message and turned his attention back to Emma and her baby. The girl looked younger in sleep, her face relaxed and peaceful for the first time since she'd stumbled into his office. But even unconscious, she maintained a protective posture with one hand resting on her son's bassinet, ready to defend him against any threat. Dr. Santos approached quietly, checking the baby's monitors before speaking. Sheriff, I've seen a lot of difficult cases in my career, but that little girl's courage is remarkable. She's been through tremendous trauma, yet her primary concern has been protecting her child and preventing other children from suffering the same abuse. She reminds me of my own daughter, Clay said quietly. Sarah would have been about Emma's age now if she'd lived. I keep thinking that maybe this is why fate put me in position to help her, to do for Emma what I couldn't do for Sarah. Your daughter died young. Car accident 10 years ago, at least that's what the official report said. But seeing what Emma went through, understanding how systematic the cover-ups can be in a small town, I'm starting to wonder if I was too trusting in accepting that explanation. Dr. Santos was quiet for a moment, studying Clay's weathered face. Sheriff, in my experience, men who carry that kind of guilt are often the ones most determined to prevent other tragedies. Your daughter would be proud of what you're doing for Emma. As Clay prepared to drive back to Cedar Ridge to face whatever consequences awaited him, he thought about the portrait hanging in the Bradford Bank. That painted image of respectability had intimidated him for too long, making him reluctant to look too closely at the shadows behind the smiles. But Emma's courage had shown him that sometimes the most important truths were hidden behind the most impressive facades. The Bradford family portrait might project power and influence, but it couldn't protect them from the testimony of a brave 12-year-old girl who refused to be silenced. And as Clay headed home to face the storm he'd unleashed, he carried with him the certainty that some fights were worth risking everything to win. The wanted posters on Clay's office wall told the story of 30 years of justice served. Bank robbers, cattle thieves, domestic abusers, and drunk drivers who'd thought they could escape the consequences of their actions. Each faded photograph represented someone who'd learned that the law applied to everyone, regardless of wealth, connections, or social standing. Clay had always taken pride in that wall, seeing it as proof that justice could prevail when good. People refused to look the other way. Now, returning to Cedar Ridge after ensuring Emma and her baby were safe in state custody, Clay wondered if those posters would soon be joined by his own. Not as a lawman who'd served justice, but as a former sheriff branded a criminal by the very people he'd sworn to protect. The town looked different in the morning light, shadows falling differently across familiar buildings, as if the events of the past day had shifted the very foundations of the community. As Clay's patrol car rolled down Main Street, he noticed how few people were visible. Shop windows that should have been bustling with morning customers stood empty, and the usual gathering of ranchers outside the feed store was nowhere to be seen. Cedar Ridge felt like a town holding its breath, waiting to see what would emerge from the confrontation between its sheriff and its most powerful family. Deputy Rivera met him at the office door, his young face creased with worry and exhaustion. "Sheriff, I'm glad you're back safe. Things have been complicated while you were gone." Clay stepped into his office, immediately noticing that several items on his desk had been moved. "Someone's been in here." Mayor Johnston came by around 10 last night with a key, said he had the authority to search for evidence of misconduct. "I tried to stop him, but he threatened to fire me on the spot if I interfered." Clay felt anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "What did they take?" "Nothing that I could see, but they spent a lot of time going through your files, particularly the ones about families who've left town in the past few years." The violation felt personal, as if strangers had invaded his home and rifled through his private belongings. But more concerning was the implication. If the mayor was destroying evidence, it suggested the cover-up involved more people than just the Bradford family. "Marcus, I need you to tell me exactly what happened after we left yesterday. Don't leave out anything, no matter how minor it might seem." Rivera settled into the chair across from Clay's desk, the same chair where Emma had sat clutching her newborn baby less than 24 hours earlier. "After you drove away, the crowd stayed for about an hour. Thomas Bradford was furious, making threats about having you arrested for kidnapping and abuse of authority. But some people started asking questions. Why was a 12-year-old girl so desperate to get away from her own family? Why was everyone so determined to silence her instead of listening to what she had to say?" Clay felt a spark of hope. "Anyone in particular asking those questions?" "Martha Caldwell, for one. After you left, she broke down completely. Started talking about how scared Emma had been for months, how she'd been afraid to leave the house or go to school. Robert Caldwell tried to shut her up, but she wasn't having it anymore." Clay thought about Emma's mother, remembering the fear and guilt he'd seen in her eyes. Sometimes it took watching someone else show courage before people found their own strength to speak truth. Mrs. Henderson from the general store also spoke up, Rivera continued. She said she'd noticed that several young girls had stopped coming to town over the past couple of years, and that when she'd asked their parents about it, she'd gotten strange answers. Sudden moves, family emergencies, decisions to homeschool that didn't make sense for families who'd always valued public education. What about the Bradford family? How did they respond to these questions? That's where things got interesting. Thomas Bradford tried to maintain his usual commanding presence, but Michael wasn't with him. Someone asked where Michael was, and Bradford said he was handling business out of town. But Jenny Morrison's aunt was in the crowd. You remember the Morrisons who left suddenly 2 years ago, and she said she'd gotten a phone call from Jenny's mother just last week. Clay leaned forward. What kind of phone call? According to the aunt, Jenny's mother was crying, saying she was sorry they'd had to leave without explaining, but that they'd been threatened with financial ruin if they stayed, and talked about why Jenny had been so frightened. She said they'd moved to Oregon, and that Jenny was slowly getting better, but that she still had nightmares about someone she called the man with cold eyes. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a clearer picture. Multiple families, forced to leave town, children traumatized and silenced, a coordinated effort to prevent victims from seeking help or justice. Clay felt sick thinking about how long this pattern might have been going on, how many children might have suffered, while the community looked the other way. After the crowd dispersed, that's when Mayor Johnston showed up with his search warrant. He spent about 2 hours going through everything in your office, and he made several phone calls while he was here. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough to know he was coordinating with someone about controlling the narrative. Clay walked to the window and looked out at the street, noting how few people were moving about their normal business. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Looking back over the past few years, can you remember any incidents involving young girls that seemed to be handled quietly, without normal police reports or follow-up investigations? Rivera was quiet for several minutes, his brow furrowed in concentration. There was that call to the Preston farm about 6 months ago. You responded alone, and when you came back, you said it was just a family dispute that had been resolved. But I remember thinking it was strange that you didn't file a report. Clay remembered that call vividly now. He'd found Tom Preston agitated and defensive, insisting that everything was fine, while clearly desperate to get Clay to leave quickly. Lucy had been in the background, pale and withdrawn, but Clay had accepted her father's assurance that she was just feeling under the weather. I think Tom Preston was being threatened, the same way the other families were threatened, and I think Lucy was another victim who was silenced before she could ask for help. Sheriff, there's something else. While the mayor was searching your office, he found your late wife's diary. He seemed very interested in some entries from about 10 years ago, right around the time Sarah died. Clay felt the world shift around him. Margaret's diary had been among his most precious possessions, a connection to the woman he'd lost to cancer just 2 years before Sarah's accident. He'd read through it countless times in the years after both losses, finding comfort in his wife's words and memories of their life together. What entries was he interested in? I couldn't see exactly, but he spent a lot of time on pages from the spring before Sarah died. He made photocopies of several entries and took them with him. Clay's mind raced back through his memories of that terrible time. Margaret had been undergoing chemotherapy, her body weakened by the treatments, but her mind still sharp and observant. She'd always been more perceptive than Clay about people's motivations and hidden agendas. If she'd written something about the Bradford family or about threats to Sarah, it might explain why the mayor was so interested in those diary entries. Marcus, I need you to help me remember something. The night Sarah died, the official report said she was coming home from a school dance when her car went off the road. But do you remember anything unusual about the circumstances? Rivera's face grew troubled. I wasn't working for you yet when that happened, but I remember hearing talk around town. Some people thought it was strange that Sarah, who was known as such a careful driver, would lose control on a road she'd driven hundreds of times. There were whispers about whether she might have been drinking or if something had distracted her. Clay felt a chill run down his spine. Sarah had been 16 when she died, exactly the age when predators might have begun targeting her. She'd been involved in school activities, which would have put her in contact with prominent community members who volunteered as chaperones or sponsors. If someone had been threatening her, if she'd been trying to escape from a situation similar to what Emma had endured. Sheriff, there's one more thing you need to know. After the mayor left last night, Martha Caldwell came by. She was crying, and she said she had something important to tell you when you got back. She wouldn't tell me what it was, but she said it was about Sarah and about things that had been happening in this town long before Emma was born. Clay realized that his investigation into Emma's assault had opened a door to secrets that went much deeper than he'd imagined. The wanted posters on his wall represented criminals he'd brought to justice, but they might soon be joined by the faces of predators who'd been operating under his nose for years, protected by influence and intimidation while he'd remained willfully blind to their crimes. The difference was that now he could see clearly, and he was determined to ensure that justice would finally be served, no matter how many powerful people stood in his way. The hidden journal lay beneath. Emma's mattress like a time bomb waiting to explode. The carefully constructed lies that had protected Cedar Ridge's darkest secrets. Martha Caldwell sat across from Clay's desk, her hands trembling as she placed the small leather-bound book between them. The journal's pages were filled with Emma's careful handwriting, documenting not just her own trauma, but a systematic pattern of abuse that had been hidden in plain sight for years. "I found this after you left with Emma yesterday," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. She'd hidden it so well that even when we searched her room looking for evidence of what had happened, we never saw it. But after seeing her courage, after watching her choose to protect her baby instead of staying quiet, I knew I had to look harder. Clay opened the journal with careful hands, immediately recognizing Emma's neat penmanship from the schoolwork she'd occasionally brought to community events. But these pages told a very different story than homework assignments or childhood dreams. They revealed a 12-year-old girl who had transformed herself into a vigilant guardian, documenting crimes against children with the methodical precision of a seasoned investigator. The first entry was dated 18 months earlier. Lucy Preston didn't come to school again today. When I asked her mama at church, she said Lucy was feeling poorly, but I saw Lucy at the general store last week and she looked scared, not sick. She kept looking over her shoulder like someone was following her. I'm going to pay attention and write down what I see. Clay felt a chill run through him as he realized Emma had been documenting suspicious patterns long before she became a victim. Herself, she'd noticed things that adults had missed or chosen to ignore, and had the courage to record them even when she didn't fully understand their significance. Sarah Hartwell was acting strange the week before she died. Read another entry from nearly 2 years ago. She came to the library every day after school, but she wasn't checking out books. She just sat in the back corner where nobody could see her, and sometimes I saw her crying. When I asked if she was okay, she said someone had been bothering her, but that she couldn't tell anyone because they wouldn't believe her. Clay's vision blurred as he read his daughter's name in Emma's careful script. The journal entry was dated just 5 days before Sarah's fatal car accident, and it described behavior that Clay had never known about. Sarah had been frightened of someone hiding in the library, crying alone, and he'd been completely oblivious to her distress. "There's more," Martha said quietly, seeing Clay's emotional reaction. "Emma wrote about other girls too. She was trying to keep track of everyone she thought might be in danger." Clay continued reading, each entry revealing another piece of a horrifying puzzle. Emma had documented Jenny Morrison's increasing absences from school, Lucy Preston's sudden withdrawal from church activities, and the strange circumstances surrounding several families' abrupt departures from Cedar Ridge. But it was the entries about Sarah that struck Clay with devastating force. "I think someone hurt Sarah Hartwell and made it look like an accident," Emma had written in a shaky hand. "She told me the day before she died that she was going to tell her father everything, no matter what threats they made. She said she couldn't let them hurt any more girls. The next day she was dead." Clay had to set the journal down for a moment, overwhelmed by the implications of what he was reading. His daughter hadn't died in a random accident. She'd been murdered to prevent her from exposing the same pattern of abuse that Emma had endured. "Mr. Bradford came to see me that night," Martha continued, her voice growing stronger as she found the courage to speak truth. "After Sarah's accident, he said he was sorry for our loss, as if Emma and Sarah had been close friends, which they weren't really. But then he said something strange. He said that sometimes good girls make bad choices, and that it was important for families to keep private matters private." Clay looked up from the journal, understanding now why Bradford had visited the Caldwells after Sarah's death. He'd been gauging their reaction, making sure they understood the consequences of speaking publicly about anything they might have observed. "I didn't think much of it at the time," Martha admitted. "Robert said I was reading too much into a condolence visit. But when Emma started having those piano lessons at the Bradford house, and she began acting so frightened and withdrawn, I started remembering that conversation differently." Clay turned to another section of the journal, finding entries that detailed Emma's own victimization with heartbreaking clarity. She documented each assault, each threat, each promise that speaking out would result in her family losing everything they'd worked for. But she'd also recorded something else, evidence that Michael Bradford wasn't acting alone. "James Bradford was there sometimes," one entry read. "He would watch from the doorway and laugh when I cried." Michael said his brother was learning the family business, that someday James would have his own special room and his own collection of girls who understood their place. The systematic nature of it made Clay sick. This wasn't one disturbed individual acting on impulse. It was a coordinated effort involving multiple perpetrators and a network of enablers who ensured victims remained silent. "Emma wrote about seeing other girls at the Bradford property," Martha said. "Girls from neighboring towns, girls whose families thought they were visiting for social calls or educational opportunities. She said the Bradford family had been doing this for years, maybe decades." Clay found the entry Martha was referring to, written in Emma's most careful handwriting. "I saw Lucy Preston leaving the back entrance of the Bradford house last week. She didn't see me, but I could tell she'd been crying. Her dress was torn, just like mine always is afterward. I wanted to run to her, to tell her she wasn't alone, but I was too scared. I should have been braver. I should have helped her." The guilt in those words, a child blaming herself for not protecting another child from adult predators, broke something inside Clay. Emma had been carrying the weight of not just her own trauma, but the responsibility for other victims she'd been powerless to save. "There's something else," Martha said, reaching into her purse and withdrawing several photographs. "These were hidden with the journal. I think Emma must have taken them somehow." The photographs showed the interior of a cabin sparsely furnished, but with clear evidence of its purpose. A bed with restraints, cameras positioned to record activities, and walls covered with photographs of young girls in various states of distress. Clay recognized some of the faces, Jenny Morrison, Lucy Preston, and others he'd seen around town over the years, but it was the final photograph that made his blood run cold. It showed Sarah, clearly terrified, looking directly at the camera, with an expression of desperate pleading. She was wearing the dress she'd died in, the one she'd worn to the school dance on her last night alive. "Emma somehow got inside their cabin and took these pictures," Martha said. "I don't know how she managed it or how she got out safely, but she was building evidence. She was trying to document everything so that someday, somehow, the truth would Come out! Clay studied the photographs with professional detachment, his law enforcement training helping him catalogue the evidence even as his heart broke over what his daughter had endured. The cabin appeared to be the same one Emma had mentioned. In her testimony, the special place, where Michael Bradford had told her he'd been operating since he was 16. "Martha," Clay said quietly, "why are you showing me this now? Why didn't you bring it forward yesterday when Emma first asked for help?" The woman's face crumpled with shame and regret. "Because I was a coward. Because I was afraid of what would happen to our family if we challenged the Bradfords. Because I chose my own comfort over my daughter's safety. And I've been living with that guilt every day since she first started coming home from those piano lessons, different, scared, and withdrawn." Clay closed the journal carefully, understanding that it represented not just evidence of crimes, but a testament to Emma's extraordinary courage. A 12-year-old girl had done what an entire community of adults had failed to do. She documented the truth, preserved evidence, and ultimately found the strength to seek justice. Emma wasn't just a victim, he said with growing amazement. She was an investigator. She was trying to protect other children, even while she was being abused herself. The journal and photographs changed everything. They provided corroboration for Emma's testimony, evidence of a systematic pattern of abuse, and most importantly, proof that Sarah's death hadn't been an accident. His daughter had been murdered to silence her, just as other children had been. Threatened, intimidated, and driven from their homes. But Emma's documentation also provided something else: hope. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Clay had evidence that couldn't be dismissed as the confused testimony of a traumatized child. He had proof that would force even the most powerful families in Cedar Ridge to face consequences for their crimes. As Martha Caldwell sat across from him, tears streaming down her face, but her shoulders straighter than they'd been in years, Clay realized that Emma's courage had awakened something in her mother as well. The conspiracy of silence that had protected the Bradford family for so long was finally beginning to crack, one person at a time. The hidden journal would become the key to unlocking justice, not just for Emma, but for all the children whose voices had been silenced over the years, including his own daughter, whose memory would finally be honored with the truth she died trying to reveal. The town bell rope hung heavy in Clay's hands as he stood at the base of the old tower, feeling the weight of 30 years of accumulated secrets pressing down on his shoulders. The braided hemp was coarse against his palms, worn smooth by decades of weather, but still strong enough to carry the sound of truth across every corner of Cedar Ridge. In all his years as sheriff, Clay had never pulled this rope, never had cause to summon the entire community for a reckoning that would shake the very foundations of their carefully maintained illusions. The baby had stabilized overnight, his breathing stronger and his color improved under the watchful care of the state hospital's pediatric team. Emma remained at his bedside, her young face showing a maturity far beyond her 12 years as she watched over the child who represented both her greatest trauma and her most precious hope. The state investigators had spent hours interviewing her, documenting not just her own experiences, but the systematic pattern of abuse her hidden journal revealed. Detective Rodriguez had called Clay an hour earlier with an update that both vindicated his instincts and horrified him with its implications. "Sheriff, we've contacted families in 3 neighboring counties who left their communities abruptly over the past 5 years. Every single one involves a young daughter who exhibited signs of trauma, and every single one mentions threats from powerful local families if they attempted to seek justice. We're looking at a network of abuse that spans multiple towns and possibly multiple states." Now, standing beneath the bell that had been silent for 20 years, Clay understood that the moment of reckoning had arrived. Emma's courage in documenting the truth, Martha Caldwell's decision to come forward with the journal, and the state investigation's confirmation of systematic abuse had created a perfect storm that would either cleanse Cedar Ridge of its corruption or tear the community apart in the process. Deputy Rivera approached from the direction of the main street, his young face grim with purpose. "Sheriff, I've got updates from around town. Word about Emma's journal is spreading, and people are starting to ask questions they should have been asking years ago." Clay looked up at the bell tower, calculating how long it would take him to climb the wooden ladder and reach the rope mechanism. The tower stood 40 feet high, its weathered boards creaking in the morning wind, offering a view of the entire valley that surrounded Cedar Ridge. From that height, he would be able to see every home, every business, every hiding place where secrets had festered in darkness. "What kind of questions?" Clay asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Mrs. Henderson at the general store has been going through her records, documenting which families stopped coming to town regularly over the past few years. She's identified at least 8 families whose shopping patterns changed dramatically around the time their daughters reached adolescence." Clay felt a grim satisfaction that the community's merchants were beginning to connect the dots their law enforcement had missed. "Anyone else coming forward?" "Pastor Williams stopped by this morning. He said he's been reviewing his Sunday school attendance records and noticed a pattern of young girls stopping their religious education around age 12 or 13. He always assumed it was normal teenage rebellion, but now he's wondering if there was something more sinister involved." The pieces of evidence were accumulating like storm clouds on the horizon. Each new revelation added weight to what Clay was about to do, but it also increased the stakes. The Bradford family and their allies wouldn't surrender their power without a fight, and pulling that bell rope would declare war on the most influential people in the county. "Marcus, I need you to understand something. Once I ring that bell, there's no going back. The entire community will be forced to choose sides, and some of those choices are going to destroy relationships that have existed for generations." Rivera adjusted his badge and straightened his shoulders. "Sheriff, my wife died because she couldn't get the medical care she needed when her cancer returned. The doctors in this county all have financial connections to the Bradford family, and none of them would treat her without payment in advance that we didn't have. If these same people have been hurting children for years while hiding behind their money and influence, then it's time someone held them accountable." Clay studied his deputy's face, seeing the same determination that had driven him to protect Emma despite the personal cost. Rivera had lost his wife to a system that prioritized wealth over human life, and now he was ready to fight that same system to protect other vulnerable people. "I want you to position yourself at the base of the tower while I'm climbing up. If anyone tries to stop me from ringing the bell, you'll need to give me enough time to get the message out." "What message exactly are you planning to send, Sheriff?" Clay looked toward the center of town, where the Bradford Bank building rose, above the surrounding structures like a monument to accumulated power. "I'm going to tell this community that one of their children documented years of systematic abuse, that she was brave enough to preserve evidence even while being victimized, and that the time has come for everyone to decide whether they stand with the victims or with the predators." As they prepared to walk toward the bell tower, Martha Caldwell appeared from the direction of the residential district, moving with purpose despite her obvious exhaustion. Behind her walked 3 other women, Mrs. Henderson from the general store, Pastor Williams' wife Rebecca, and most surprisingly Eleanor Bradford, the matriarch of the family whose crimes were about to be exposed. "Sheriff Hartwell," Eleanor Bradford said as the group approached, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "I need to speak with you before you do whatever you're planning to do." Clay studied Thomas Bradford's wife, noting how different she looked from the polished woman in the family portrait at the bank. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled, her perfectly styled hair disheveled, and her face showed the kind of devastation that comes from having illusions shattered by inescapable truth. "Mrs. Bradford, if you're here to ask me to protect your family's reputation, I'm here to give you this," she interrupted, holding out a wooden box about the size of a jewelry case. These are photographs and documents that my husband thought he'd hidden from me. I found them last night after you left town with Emma, and I've spent the past 10 hours deciding whether to burn them or bring them to you." Clay accepted the box with careful hands, understanding that its contents might provide the final piece of evidence needed to ensure justice for all the victims. "What made you decide to bring them to me?" Eleanor Bradford's composure finally cracked completely. "Because I saw the photographs of that little girl, of Emma, and I realized that I've been living with monsters. Because I remembered other young women who came to our house over the years for various reasons, and how they always seemed frightened around my sons. Because I've been a coward who chose comfort over conscience, and I can't live with that anymore." Clay opened the box and immediately understood why Eleanor Bradford had spent 10 hours wrestling with her decision. The photographs and documents inside represented decades of crimes, meticulously documented by someone who had never expected them to be discovered. There were pictures of the cabin Emma had described, records of payments to families to ensure their silence, and correspondence with similar networks in other towns. Most damning of all was a photograph of Sarah, taken the day before her death, with a handwritten note attached. "SH becoming problematic. Threatens to expose everything to father. Immediate action required." Clay's hands trembled as he read those words, finally understanding that his daughter's death hadn't been a random accident, but a calculated murder designed to protect the Bradford family's secrets. The grief and guilt he'd carried for 10 years transformed into something harder and more focused, a determination to ensure that Sarah's death would finally serve the cause of justice she'd died trying to advance. "Mrs. Bradford," he said quietly, "I want you to know that bringing this evidence forward probably saved other children from the same fate Emma and my daughter endured. Your courage in choosing truth over family loyalty makes you part of the solution instead of part of the problem." Eleanor Bradford nodded, wiping tears from her face. "Sheriff, when you ring that bell, I want you to know that not everyone in my family was part of this conspiracy. My younger son James was manipulated by his father and brother, but there might still be hope for him if he gets help, and I'll testify against my own husband and older son if that's what it takes to make sure this never happens again." As Clay prepared to climb the bell tower, he realized that the evidence in the box, combined with Emma's journal and the testimony of other victims, would be more than enough to ensure convictions and end the Bradford family's reign of terror. But justice required more than evidence. It required a community willing to face the truth and choose courage over comfort. The ladder to the bell tower was steeper than he'd expected, each weathered rung testing his aging muscles as he climbed toward the rope that would change everything. Halfway up, he paused to look down at the small group gathered at the base. Rivera standing guard, Martha Caldwell clutching her daughter's journal, Eleanor Bradford preparing to betray her own family in service of justice. These were the people who would rebuild Cedar Ridge after the reckoning, who would ensure that future children never suffered in silence. At the top of the tower, Clay could see the entire valley spread out below him. The Bradford Ranch dominated the western hills, its vast holdings representing decades of accumulated power built on the suffering of children. The town itself looked deceptively peaceful in the morning light, its tree-lined streets and neat houses hiding the secrets that had festered in darkness for too long. Clay wrapped his hands around the bell rope, feeling its familiar weight and understanding that this single act would divide his life into before and after. Before, when he'd been a respected lawman who maintained order through cooperation and compromise. After, when he would be the man who pulled down the powerful and stood with the powerless, regardless of the cost. The morning air carried the sounds of a town going about its normal business. Cars starting, dogs barking, children playing in yards where their parents believed them safe. In a few minutes, that illusion of safety would be shattered, but perhaps something stronger would take its place. A community that protected all its children, not just those from the right families. Clay thought of Emma, lying in a hospital bed, beside her newborn son, her 12-year-old hands steady as she fed him from a bottle under the watchful eyes of nurses who saw her courage rather than her shame. He thought of Sarah, who had died trying to expose the truth he was about to proclaim. He thought of all the other children whose names he might never know, but whose suffering was about to be acknowledged and avenged. He pulled the rope with all his strength, and the bell's voice rang out across Cedar Ridge like the sound of justice finally arriving. The bronze tone echoed off the valley walls, calling every soul to witness the truth that could no longer be hidden. As the sound faded, Clay could see people emerging from buildings, stopping their cars, looking up at the bell tower with confusion and growing understanding. The reckoning had begun, and there would be no turning back. The bell's sound rolled across Cedar Ridge like thunder, its bronze voice carrying farther than Clay had imagined possible. From his position atop the tower, he watched people emerge from buildings throughout the town. Shopkeepers stepping onto sidewalks, ranchers stopping their trucks in the middle of the street, families pausing their morning routines to stare up at the source of the summons they hadn't heard in 20 years. The sound seemed to hang in the mountain air long after the bell had stopped swinging, as if the valley itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what truth would be proclaimed. From this high perch, Clay climbed down the ladder with deliberate care, knowing that every person gathering below would be watching his descent, trying to understand why their sheriff had chosen this dramatic method of communication. By the time Clay's boots touched the ground, a crowd of nearly 100 people had assembled in the square surrounding the bell tower. Their faces showed confusion, concern, and in some cases, fear. Word of Emma's flight and Clay's defiance of the town's power structure had spread through the community like wildfire, and many suspected that this gathering would force them to choose sides in a conflict they'd preferred to ignore. Thomas Bradford pushed through the crowd with the aggressive confidence of a man accustomed to having his commands obeyed immediately. His expensive suit was perfectly pressed, despite the early hour, his silver hair styled with military precision, his face showing none of the doubt or vulnerability that had marked his wife's appearance. Behind him came Mayor Johnston, several town council members, and a handful of prominent business owners who clearly expected this disruption to be quickly resolved in their favor. "Sheriff Hartwell," Bradford called out, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "this theatrical display has gone far enough. You've caused enough disruption to our community with your reckless accusations and grandstanding. It's time to restore order and common sense to this situation." Clay stood beside the bell tower's base, feeling the solid wood against his back like moral support from the town's founders who had installed this instrument of democratic accountability. Deputy Rivera flanked him on one side, Martha Caldwell on the other, with Eleanor Bradford standing slightly apart but clearly aligned with the forces of truth rather than family loyalty. "Mr. Bradford," Clay said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "I rang this bell because our community needs to hear the truth about what's been happening to our children. For too long, we've allowed comfort and convenience to blind us to the suffering of the most vulnerable among us." Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that Clay's words were directed at all of them, not just the Bradford family. The conspiracy of silence that had protected predators required the participation of good people who chose not to see, not to ask questions, not to challenge authority when children's lives were at stake. "You're talking about wild allegations, if from a disturbed child," Bradford replied, his tone suggesting that reasonable people should dismiss such claims without serious consideration. "Emma Caldwell is clearly traumatized by her situation, and her confused testimony shouldn't be used to destroy the reputation of upstanding families." Martha Caldwell stepped forward, her voice shaking but determined. "Emma isn't confused. And she isn't lying. I brought Sheriff Hartwell this journal that my daughter had hidden in her room, pages and pages of careful documentation about what you and your sons have been doing to children in this town." She held up Emma's journal, its leather cover worn from careful handling, its pages filled with evidence that several people in the crowd recognized. Whispered conversations began among the gathered townspeople, as parents remembered their own children's unexplained fears, sudden changes in behavior, or reluctance to participate in activities involving certain prominent families. Bradford's composure slipped slightly as he saw the journal, but he quickly recovered his commanding presence. That book could contain anything. The fantasies of a troubled girl, lies designed to seek attention, or deliberate fabrications meant to extort money from successful families. You can't seriously expect this community to accept such dubious evidence. Eleanor Bradford moved closer to her husband, her face pale but resolute. Thomas, stop lying. I found your photographs. I found the records of payments to families you forced to leave town. I found the correspondence with similar networks in other communities. I know what you and Michael have been doing, and I know that Sarah Hartwell was murdered to keep her quiet. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs at this revelation from Bradford's own wife. Several people began talking at once, their voices rising as the implications of Eleanor's words sank in. Sarah Hartwell had been beloved in the community, her death mourned as a tragic accident that had broken her father's heart. The suggestion that she'd been murdered transformed everyone's understanding of both past and present events. Thomas Bradford's mask of civility finally cracked completely. Eleanor, you don't know what you're talking about. You're hysterical, influenced by malicious gossip and wild theories. I won't allow you to destroy everything our family has built based on your confused, emotional state. But the damage was done. Bradford's wife had publicly accused him of systematic child abuse and murder, and her testimony carried the weight of intimate knowledge that couldn't be easily dismissed. The crowd pressed closer, their collective energy shifting from confusion to anger as they began to understand the scope of the crimes that had been committed in their midst. Emma's voice seemed to carry across the valley, even though she was miles away. Speaking through the testimony, Deputy Rivera read aloud from the journal that had documented years of systematic abuse. The crowd listened in growing horror as the 12-year-old's careful words revealed not just her own suffering, but a pattern of crimes that had destroyed multiple families and driven victims from their homes in shame and terror. I couldn't save Jenny Morrison, Rivera read, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the words. She tried to tell people what Michael Bradford did to her, but they said she was making up stories for attention. Her family lost their business because Mr. Bradford owned the bank, and they had to leave town with nothing. I promised myself I would document everything so that someday someone would believe us. Several women in the crowd began crying as they recognized the names of children they'd known, children whose sudden departures or behavioral changes now made terrible sense. The Morrison family had been well-regarded members of the community, their feed store a gathering place for ranchers and farmers who needed both supplies and honest advice. Their abrupt departure had been explained as an economic necessity, but now the truth revealed itself as something far more sinister. Pastor Williams stepped forward from the crowd, his face gray with the weight of his own recognition. I remember Jenny Morrison coming to me before her family left town. She tried to tell me that someone had hurt her, but His voice broke with shame. I told her that good Christian girls didn't make such accusations against respected families. I told her to pray for forgiveness and to stop spreading gossip that could hurt innocent people. The pastor's confession sent shockwaves through the gathered townspeople, many of whom had similarly dismissed or ignored signs that children were in danger. The conspiracy of silence hadn't required active participation from most community members. It had only required their willingness to look away when inconvenient truths demanded uncomfortable actions. Thomas Bradford sensed the crowd's mood shifting against him and made one final attempt to control the narrative. This is exactly the kind of mob mentality that destroys innocent people, he declared, his voice rising above the murmur of conversation. You're allowing yourselves to be manipulated by a disturbed child and a sheriff who's clearly lost his objectivity. Where is the evidence? Where are the witnesses? Where is anything beyond the ravings of traumatized individuals who are looking for someone to blame? In response, Clay opened the wooden box that Eleanor Bradford had given him, withdrawing photographs that showed the interior of the cabin where assaults had taken place. He held up images that clearly showed restraints, recording equipment, and walls covered with pictures of young victims in various states of distress. "Here is your evidence, Mr. Bradford," Clay said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "These photographs were taken by your own son, documenting his crimes with the same attention to detail that Emma used in her journal. Your wife found them hidden in your home and brought them to me because she couldn't live with the knowledge of what you and Michael had been doing." The crowd pressed closer to see the photographs, their collective gasp of horror confirming what many had suspected, but been afraid to acknowledge. Several parents pulled their children behind them, instinctively protecting them from the visual evidence of what other children had endured. But it was the final photograph that broke whatever remaining support Bradford might have retained. Clay held up the image of Sarah Hartwell, clearly terrified, wearing the dress she died in the next day. Written on the back in Michael Bradford's handwriting were the words that confirmed she'd been murdered to protect the family's secrets. "Sarah Hartwell was 16 years old when she decided to expose what you were doing," Clay said, his voice thick with emotion but steady with purpose. "She was going to tell me everything, and you couldn't allow that to happen. So you killed her and made it look like an accident, and I spent 10 years believing I'd lost my daughter to teenage carelessness instead of adult evil." The crowd's energy shifted dramatically, transforming from confusion and doubt to unified outrage. People who had known and loved Sarah began shouting questions and accusations, their voices rising in a crescendo of long-suppressed anger and grief. Thomas Bradford realized that his position had become untenable. Without the protection of community silence and willful ignorance, he was just a criminal whose crimes had finally been exposed to the light. He looked around desperately for allies, but found only faces filled with disgust and betrayal. "Where is Michael?" someone in the crowd shouted. "If he's responsible for all this, where is he now?" Bradford's silence answered the question. Michael had fled, probably warned by his father about the gathering evidence and the collapse of their protective network. But his absence only reinforced the perception of guilt, and the crowd's anger intensified as they realized that one of the primary perpetrators had escaped immediate accountability. Clay felt the weight of 30 years of law enforcement experience as he prepared to address the crowd one final time. Emma's voice had finally been heard, not just by him, but by the entire community that had failed to protect her. The truth was out, the evidence was overwhelming, and the moment had come for justice to be served by people who would no longer allow children to suffer in silence. 6 months later, the new birth certificate lay on Clay's desk, bearing the name David Samuel Caldwell. Emma had chosen to honor both her baby's life and the memory of the man whose compass had guided them through their darkest hours. The document represented more than legal paperwork. It was proof that a child born from trauma could still claim a place in the world, protected by law and surrounded by a community finally committed to safeguarding its most vulnerable members. Emma sat across from Clay's desk, her 13-year-old face showing the kind of maturity that comes from surviving unimaginable trials and finding strength in truth-telling. Little David dozed in her arms, healthy and growing, his earlier medical complications resolved through proper care and the love of a young mother who had refused to let shame define their future. "Sheriff Hartwell," Emma said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned her words carried weight and meaning. "I wanted to thank you one more time before we leave for Denver. If you hadn't believed me that first day, if you hadn't had the courage to ring the town bell, David, and I would probably be dead by now." Clay felt the familiar weight of emotion that came whenever he contemplated how close they had come to losing both Emma and her baby. The state investigation had revealed that the Bradford family had made arrangements with a network in another state to handle problematic situations, arrangements that had apparently been used to silence other victims permanently when threats and intimidation proved insufficient. Emma, you're the one who showed courage that day. A 12-year-old girl walked into my office carrying a newborn baby and had the strength to tell the truth, even when the most powerful people in town wanted her silenced. You inspired me to do the right thing, not the other way around. The trials had concluded the previous month, with Michael Bradford sentenced to 25 years in prison on multiple counts of child sexual assault and Sarah's murder. Thomas Bradford received 15 years for conspiracy and accessory charges, while several other community members faced lesser sentences for their roles in covering up the crimes. The network extended across 3 counties, ultimately resulting in more than 30 arrests and the rescue of children who had been suffering in silence for years. Eleanor Bradford had testified against her own family with devastating effectiveness, her intimate knowledge of their operations providing prosecutors with details that made conviction inevitable. She had used her considerable wealth to establish a foundation supporting child abuse victims, dedicating the remainder of her life to atoning for the years she had remained willfully blind to her family's crimes. The new family in Denver seems really nice, Emma continued, referring to the couple who had offered to provide her and David with a fresh start in a city where their history wouldn't define them. Mrs. Patterson taught middle school for 30 years, and Mr. Patterson is a counselor who works with trauma survivors. They said they want to help me finish my education and learn to be a good mother. Clay nodded, having personally vetted the Patterson family and confirmed their ability to provide Emma with the support and guidance she would need. The state had also arranged for ongoing therapy to help her process the trauma she had endured, as well as educational support to ensure that becoming a mother at 12 didn't destroy her prospects for a full life. Deputy Rivera entered the office, carrying a small wrapped package, his face showing the satisfaction of a man who had chosen the right side in a moral battle. "Sheriff, the state investigators wanted me to give you this before Emma leaves town." Clay unwrapped the package to reveal a brass compass identical to his father's, with an engraving that read, "To Sheriff Clay Hartwell, a man whose moral compass points true north, with gratitude from the children whose voices were finally heard." The symbolism wasn't lost on Clay. He had carried his father's compass throughout the investigation, drawing strength from its steady guidance when the path forward seemed uncertain. Now the state authorities were acknowledging that his moral courage had saved lives and exposed a network of crimes that might have continued for years without his willingness to challenge powerful interests. "There's something else you should know," Rivera said, his tone becoming more serious. "The state investigation has identified similar networks in 12 other small towns across 3 states. Emma's journal and the evidence from the Bradford cabin have provided templates for investigators to recognize patterns of abuse that were previously invisible." Clay felt a deep satisfaction knowing that Emma's courage would continue to protect children far beyond Cedar Ridge. Her careful documentation had become a model for law enforcement agencies dealing with systematic abuse cases, and her willingness to speak truth had inspired other young victims to come forward with their own testimonies. Emma stood to leave, adjusting David in her arms with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to balance motherhood with childhood. "Sheriff, would you do me a favor? Would you visit Sarah's grave and tell her that her story finally had a happy ending? Tell her that her death wasn't for nothing, that it helped save other girls like us." Clay's eyes filled with tears as he nodded, understanding that Emma's request represented closure not just for her own trauma, but for the guilt he had carried for 10 years over his failure to protect his daughter. Sarah's death had ultimately led to justice for multiple victims, giving her short life a meaning that transcended the tragedy of its ending. As Emma and David left Cedar Ridge for their new life in Denver, Clay walked to the cemetery where Sarah's headstone bore the simple inscription, "Beloved daughter, her voice lives on." He placed fresh flowers on her grave and shared Emma's message, feeling his daughter's presence in the warm summer breeze that rustled through the valley. The town bell rang out across Cedar Ridge every Sunday now, a weekly reminder of the community's commitment to protecting its children and facing difficult truths with courage rather than denial. New families had moved to the town, drawn by its reputation as a place where justice prevailed over influence and where children's voices were heard and believed. Clay's badge felt heavier now, weighted with the responsibility of maintaining the trust that Emma's courage had restored. But it was a good weight, the kind that reminded him daily why he had chosen to serve and protect, and why some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost. The compass that had guided him through the darkest investigation of his career now pointed steadily toward a future where children like Emma would never again have to document their own abuse in hidden journals, never again have to choose between silence and safety. It was a future worth the sacrifice, worth the courage, worth the truth that had finally set them all free.